anyway, after Samuel Adams, after we talked about him, I want to talk about Thomas Paine. This is somebody else's picture. He had his name on. There we go. Thomas Paine, the author of Common Sense. Also, I will argue a sanguine, extreme sanguine. This is how you know he's a sanguine. He failed at almost everything he ever did. He didn't do well in school. He just, he failed so many times at everything almost he tried. He even failed as a soldier. He ended up meeting Benjamin Franklin, and he brought him over, helped him come to America. But he was a writer. And so once he started writing, he inspired people. He inspired soldiers. So even though he failed at everything else, that's what he was meant to do. So I fear, like I said in the first video, we're telling ADD and ADHD kids, which I don't believe in because I think it's a personality type, that they're not smart. In actuality, they usually have very high IQs and they're very smart. And he was the same way. And I said, man, if he could just be a bricklayer and be happy like everybody else of the time, then he wouldn't have written these great things. I say the same thing about Benjamin Franklin. You know, if he could have just paid attention in school, he wouldn't have created his 254 patents. And who knows how many other things that he invented. So if he was just a little kid that folded his hands, a little firstborn girl that folded his hands and listened in class and paid attention, then he wouldn't have been looking out the window during class and saw the ducks go by and saw their feet and went, oh, look how the webbing, and maybe I could create paddles. And he created paddles so he could beat his friends swimming in the lake. And he went, oh, that was his first invention, was the paddle. So if he could have paid attention in school, maybe he wouldn't have invented all those things. Have you ever thought that maybe God made him like that so he couldn't pay attention? I once argued with somebody that said, well, isn't it your goal? Don't you think everybody should be taught to pay attention? And I said, no, it's not my goal at all. I don't think no, because they're world changers and they're big picture thinkers. And he had the strangest look on his face, but I believe I really changed him. It was somebody in my family. And I believed I really changed his perspective because we were arguing good-naturedly about it because it was like, we have to be like everybody else. And I say, no, God makes everybody different. He's given you a purpose. He's given everybody here a purpose. So anyway, he comes over here, Thomas Paine, and he writes this pamphlet. And the pamphlet is called Common Sense. And Common Sense was an overwhelming success. And really what he's saying is that it's common sense to not let a little tiny island rule a continent. I love it. Why is this little tiny island over there in England, he's calling a little tiny island ruling a continent? It's ridiculous. And how can they rule from out there? So that was what he said. America is not a British nation. It's composed of people from all of Europe, not just from England, from all of Europe. And as the mother country of America, what mother would harm her children so brutally? So he was arguing against England. And being a part of Britain would drag America into unnecessary European wars. The distance between the two nations makes colonies wait a year for an answer to a petition to Parliament. So we would petition Parliament over in England. We'd have to wait a year for the answer. By then, it's done. The Puritans believed that God wanted to give them a safe haven from the persecution of British rule. That's why they came over here. Britain rules the colonies for its own benefit. It's time to part. So one of the things he was saying about, and he wrote this whole pamphlet about kings, okay? So he said, kings cannot be trusted unless you look after them. Kings want absolute power. Haven't we found that to be true? And the people in the colonies came, you got to remember, from king after king after king after king in Europe, and especially in England. And every time they would get a king, the king would go bad. And then they'd get another king, and he would go bad. And then, you know, we had William the Conqueror, we had all these, and it was terrible, and you just had to do what the king said. It was terrible. Kings want absolute power. He said the king in England makes the law of the land just as in France, except because he sends it to Parliament. It looks like it came from Parliament and not the king. But really, the king is pulling the strings. Monarchy is ranked in Scripture as one of the sins of the Jews. So that's another thing he said. If all men are equals, how can one man set up his own family in perpetual preference to all others to inherit the title of king? So he was really ruling against the whole notion of king. Meanwhile, cut to George Washington. When he becomes our first president, do you know what we idiotic people do? Because we do what we know, okay? That's why I taught against, we fought because of taxes, because that's what I knew. I didn't know how foolish it was. I just didn't know what I didn't know. That when George Washington was president, we offered for him to be king. And George Washington, the godly, righteous man that he was, said, no, I'm not going to be a king. But he could have had anything. He could have named it. People adored him. So here we are, finally getting away from kings, and we told him he could be king. What do you want to call yourself? You want to be king? Isn't that something? And then why should a country be ruled by a child or a madman just because he came from a particular family? So he was making his case. Common sense. It's common sense that we separate. So he proposed a constitution and a republic. Listen, y'all, we do not live in a democracy. You don't want to live in a democracy. A democracy is mob rule. In a democracy, the majority wins. We live in a republic. We live in a representative republic. So when we talk about elections, that's what happened. We as people, we take a certain amount of people and we elect somebody to represent us, and those representatives go to they either serve in part of the government in Texas, and then they go and where we have the Texas legislature and all that, or they go to Washington D.C. and serve there, because you have state elections and you have national elections, and they're supposed to rule for us and for the good of the people. All right, he sold 500,000 copies. There's only 2.5 million people here, and he sold 500,000 copies. You know how many that is? And he paid for it himself. First printing himself. He blamed the colony's problems on King George and advocated for a Declaration of Independence. So many of these ideas came from him and from John Locke in England. He claimed that America had a moral obligation to the rest of the world to revolt against tyranny. I say we do now too, because guess what? We're the only ones in the rest of the world. People come here to escape tyranny in other places. And what if now we have to sit under tyranny, so we have a moral obligation. And he stirred colonists to strengthen their resolve toward fighting for independence. So you had the preachers telling people this is a godly thing. You had common sense go out. You had Samuel Adams doing his campaign of whisper and saying, had Paul Revere put out, as a matter of fact, it's this picture right here that Paul Revere went and engraved and put out and called it the Boston Massacre. This is a very famous painting. In this painting, it looks like these soldiers came out and massacred people, but that's not what happened at all, and we'll talk about that. It really was propaganda. Matter of fact, our own guys, our own freedom fighters like John Adams, defended the soldiers because it really wasn't their fault. They're young kids. We had 100 colonists that surrounded them with rocks and ice and bricks and really scared them. Really, really scared them. So it really wasn't their fault. But we were just trying to stir propaganda. We wanted people to fight against the king. Felt like it was a moral war and a just war. Now, what was also happening during this time, right before all this, is we had the Great Awakening. So all these people stopped going to church and they weren't doing anything. And then you had these great men of God coming through, and they would travel around and they were telling people about the Lord, and people were getting saved in mass, just masses of people were getting saved. So it was becoming kind of a godless country. It was just the colonies then, and all of a sudden everybody got saved. So before all this American Revolution stuff happened, men's hearts were stirring back towards the Lord, and they really felt like this was a very godly war. All right, so that's Thomas Paine. What was the name of the pamphlet he wrote? Common Sense, good. It was a pamphlet. How many copies did it sell? 500,000. There's only 2.5 million people here. That means 1 out of every 5 people had a copy of that. That's incredible. All right, and people were starting to talk about it. People were saying, hey, now who's this again? Thomas Paine. Good. I knew you guys knew this. All right, this is, since we already just talked about the Boston Massacre, I'm going to go ahead and talk about it. This is the Boston Massacre. I'm paying attention to the time, so we'll have to continue. This is the Boston Massacre. And what happened, like I said, was the soldiers would say, hey, move along, move along. They were getting people out of the streets. It was like we were in occupied territory. Well, there was a kid that kind of came up, and the colonists hated the soldiers, and the soldiers were quartering in our home and all that too, quartering in our homes. And so he was kind of giving the soldier a hard time, so the soldier butted him with the bottom of his weapon, his shotgun. He kind of butted him and kind of hurt the kid, and he left off, and so the colonists got really mad about that. But remember, tensions are high anyway. They're taking our money, they're ruling our favor, they're against us, they're seizing our ships, they're entering wherever they want, wherever they wanted. The king was paying them, so they didn't answer to the people. They couldn't be taken out of office, and all this was going on. So you had three at first very young soldiers standing there, And all of a sudden, about 100 colonists surrounded them with rocks, bricks, and ice in the wintertime. And they got closer and closer, and they were taunting, and they were throwing the rocks and bricks and ice. It wasn't like they were just standing there, and they were calling them lobster backs and go home, and they were calling them names. And the soldiers were kind of scared. They were young. Well, all of a sudden, 2 more soldiers came, and the general came, and the 2 soldiers there, and they're kind of standing there, and they don't know what happened, if one of the guys' kids slipped or what. But remember, people are hurling ice and bricks and rocks at them. They are not shooting, but people are hurling stuff at them, calling them names. Something happened, and a gun went off, and a guy named Crispus Attucks with a C, got killed. He was the first one killed. He was a black man and a former slave, but 5 people ended up getting killed, okay? So there ended up being 3 to 5 soldiers there, and 5 people ended up getting killed, but it really was kind of an accident. A gun went off, and then people started firing, and then they realized, because the soldiers were scared, and so they realized. So that's why it's called the Boston Massacre. Well, what happened is really not this, but Samuel Adams was there, and he saw an opportunity. And so Samuel Adams said to Paul Revere, who was a silversmith, he said, hurry, go, run, make an engraving of this and show it as a massacre. And he told them kind of what to show it. And this is the engraving that Paul Revere made. And then they gave it to the committees of correspondence, and it went out, and everybody got this picture. And when they looked at this picture, like, oh my gosh, the British have now gone too far. They're massacring us in the streets. We knew, it's enough. So you had Samuel Adams stirring up things. You had Thomas Paine with the whole common sense thing. You had standing troops, and them taking all of our money, and we're not allowed to trade, and all these things happening with dissolving our legislature. We wanted to we've already talked about many of the colonies from the very beginning wanted to end slavery, and we would actually outlaw slavery in the colonies, and then King George would veto it. So all this was going on, and then when you had the Boston Massacre happen, and that happened, people just said enough. It really was one of the turning points, and unfortunately, it was propaganda. This isn't really what happened, and that's why 2 of our guys, including John Adams, defended them in court so that they wouldn't get hanged. Because they said, no, it wasn't really a Boston. It wasn't really a massacre, because they knew that people were against him and that probably they would be hanged. All right, this is King George, the guy we were fighting against in England, and he later went crazy. By the way, Thomas Paine that we talked about, he wrote Common Sense, he wrote some other things, but later in his life, he kind of wrote some things about, he just wrote some weird stuff about the Lord, maybe not being the only deity and all these things, and so people shunned him. So later on, he wrote about 6 things that really inspired people. He kind of got into some weird stuff, and people just shunned him. That's just what they did. You got him away. All right, this is John Hancock, a very wealthy merchant that lived in Boston. Most of these people that I'm talking about today live in Boston, and lived in Boston, and it's because that's where the first rumblings of the Revolution really was, and a lot of the things took place right around Boston at the very beginning. It's not that things weren't happening in other places, but it was kind of the hub. So this is John Hancock, how we look back then. And this is John Adams, who is Samuel Adams' cousin and the 2nd president of the United States. So he's one of the ones that defended the guys of the Boston Massacre. He was an outstanding man of character. Even though he wanted the big Federalist government, and Thomas Jefferson wanted the little anti-Federalist government, he was a man that had good character. He really was. So, all right, we are next going to talk about Benjamin Rust, maybe. I'm not sure. But stay tuned for part 3.